Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associate's interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and it is spring. So today, we're embarking on a journey back in time to 1924, a year that marked a pinnacle moment in sports history, spring sports. I'm sure you're getting the drift, but we are going to capture the spirit and imagination of a nation at that time. In an era dominated by legends like Babe Ruth and overshadowed by teams and storied legacies, a group of scrappy underdogs, the Washington Senators, dared to challenge the status quo. In the centennial year of the Senators' victorious World Series run, our guest today is Smithsonian Associate, sports historian, and author Fred Fromer. Fred Fromer has written the new book, You Gotta Have Heart, Washington Baseball from Walter Johnson to the 2019 World Series champion Nationals. Fred Fromer and baseball author Gary Sarnoff, who has a new book out about the Washington 24 Senators, are going to co-host a session at Smithsonian Associates, and we have Fred Fromer today. He's going to tell us this compelling story of the history-making team. And please check out our website for more details. But Fred Fromer joins us today as a brief tease of his upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, so stay tuned. Fred Fromer tells us today of a story of a team guided by a 27-year-old player-manager, Bucky Harris, and fueled by the indomitable spirit of an aging pitcher, Walter Johnson. Together, Bucky and Walter Johnson embarked on a quest to dethrone the baseball giants of the day, the New York Yankees, against all odds and amidst a backdrop of cultural upheaval and innovation. The Senators not only captured the hearts of Americans, but also clinched the World Series title. The Senators became a symbol of hope and resilience. Join us as we delve into this incredible story with Smithsonian Associate, author, and sports historian Fred Fromer, exploring the Senators' unlikely victory, its impact on the nation, and how for one fleeting summer, Washington, D.C. became the center of the baseball universe. Prepare to be inspired by an unforgettable tale of triumph, tenacity, and the enduring power of dreaming big. Please join me in welcoming author, Smithsonian Associate, Fred Fromer. Fred Fromer, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
So nice to talk to you. This beautiful spring day where I am. I think so many of us are, our thoughts are turning to baseball. Spring training is just a rite of passage. I love the game of baseball, and so getting a chance to talk to you about this subject is just a real joy, and I'm looking forward to it. Your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation will be wonderful. It'll be a great baseball story. You're going to, of course, be there with Gary Sarnoff, who's got a new book out. I'm going to put links so that our audience can find out more information about you and your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, Gary Sarnoff, and information about Gary. But congratulations on all this. And let's just start at the start. Why don't you just tell us briefly about your presentation and how you'll use Zoom to engage us, because we're all on Zoom these days.
Yeah, it's not as good as in person, but we'll make the best of it. We'll be using some photos. There are a lot of great archival photos from that 1924 season when the Washington Senators, stunned the baseball world and won the city's first World Series title, and the only one in the 20th century. So we'll discuss a lot of the highlights using those photos, and also some of the lowlights that followed over the last half century or so. But in the Senators' defense, they did have a good decade there from 24 to 33. Went on to them in that World Series in 24. They repeated as American League champs in 25. They lost the World Series to the Pirates in 7 games, and they were back in the World Series in 1933, but they lost in a rematch to the New York Giants. But they had 3 pennants in 10 years, which is a really good track record and a great track record by Washington baseball standards.
Thank you for that. As I say, this is going to be very fun, enjoyable presentation on your part. And I think the photos, the high points and the low points will be great to see. What was it about that performance, their kind of run up to 1924 that, led them to change, to spark this turnaround that they had? I think it was 92 and 62, I think was their 24 records. That sound about right?
That sounds about right. I may actually have that on my computer here. Yeah, you're right. 92 and 62 and two ties back when in the land of ties, when we had ties in baseball. Well, I think there are several factors. I think pitching is the most important one. It's always the case, or often the case. The year before 1923, they had a really middle-of-the-pack pitching staff, and that matched their fourth-place finish in the American League. There were only 8 teams. They were really kind of a mediocre team all across the board. Even Walter Johnson, who was one of the best pitchers of all time, he had a down year, a 3.48 ERA, which was the second worst of his career to that point. But they really turned around in 1924. They had a 3.34 ERA, best in the league. And Johnson, who was 36, was able to return to prime form. He went 23-7, a 2.72 ERA, led the league in ERA, strikeouts, wins, even at 2.83. So the guy did it all. And then if you'll forgive a reference to my book, which is called You Gotta Have Heart, this team had a lot of heart. They hustled and scraped and found lots of ways to beat you.
Yeah, good. Well, I do want to talk a little bit about You Gotta Have Heart. It's a history of Washington baseball from 1859 to the 2012 National League East champions. A great run.
If I could just a quick, I don't want to go off.
Please.
We record that, but actually, that's an older version, but the newer version is, and hopefully Smithsonian has this online. Maybe they have their own. It's now, the first part of it's right, but it's through the 2019 World Series. Actually, let me get the exact title so I don't screw it up.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. It's called You Gotta Have Heart, and I can email it to you. Washington baseball from Walter Johnson to the 2019 World Series National League champion. World Series champion Nationals.
Excellent.
That's a mouthful, I know.
No, that's a great title, and I will. Please do email it. I'll make sure and find it online. Again, we'll put links so that our audience can find out more about you, Fred Fromer, and this book and all of your wonderful work. The Senators, it's rare for a sports team to really grab the heart of the nation, and yet the Senators did it. And so timing is everything. What was it about that time and elements of the story that really made them America's team? Because that was a big deal with fans. Yeah,
a lot of different things came together that made them such a popular team in the imagination of the fans. And just to put this in context, baseball was really the only team sport that mattered back then. It was by far the most popular sport. Nobody cared about the NBA. They didn't even exist, actually, at that point. But nobody cared about professional basketball, professional football, with apologies to those hardcore fans out there. Baseball was it. And so it had this really big, dominant role in American society. And with the Senators, they had never won anything before. They had never won a World Series. They had never made the World Series. They were just not a very good team for the about 25 years or so that preceded 1924. And fans also were really, not only did fans like this underdog team, but they were sick of the New York City duopoly, as I call it, that was dominating baseball. In fact, the previous 3 years had been New York Giants versus New York Yankees. So 3 years in a row, the entire World Series took place within the confines of New York City. Now, I'm an New Yorker. I have no hate, not hating on New York, but I think that sometimes it's good to get some new teams in there. And I think a lot of fans felt that way. Another factor was Walter Johnson, as I mentioned earlier, he was 36. So he was getting towards the end of his career. And fans ached for this really quintessentially nice guy to finally get a chance to pitch in a World Series and hopefully win a World Series. There's a great column by the famed humorist Will Rogers, headlined "Everybody is Pulling for Walter." And he wrote that people were more interested in his performance that year than in the 1924 presidential election. And finally, the Senators were such underdogs, as I referenced earlier. They came out of nowhere. They'd come in fourth place the year before. They were a scrappy team that was last in the league in home runs. Can believe this, or if you can believe it, 22 home runs the entire season, and Johnson hit one of those. But they played an exciting game of small ball that fans really were attracted to.
Exciting times. The other thing that I found that, frankly, it really surprised me because Bucky Harris, 27-year-old rookie player manager. Can you imagine a player manager, especially 27-year-old and a rookie on top of all of that? What are the odds? What was it about Harris that you found that I didn't know this story? I thought it was fascinating, and maybe tell us a little bit about his leadership style that ultimately contributed to this team's success.
Sure, he wasn't actually a rookie player. He'd been playing for a few seasons, but he was a rookie manager.
Okay.
So he was a very young manager, doing it for the first time. And he was really a fearless leader who got the most of his players. But, this was not a universally liked decision by the Senators owner, Clark Griffith, to hire this untested 27-year-old with the keys to the franchise. In fact, sports writers called it Griffith's folly. They thought it would be a disaster. But Griffith saw something in him. He correctly assessed that Bucky Harris had this heart of a tiger, and that he would instill that in his own players. Now, it took a while for the team to gel. They started off 24-26. That's roughly a third of the way through the season. They looked like the same old Senators. But then, as Babe Ruth wrote years later in his autobiography, Washington got hot quicker than any team he'd ever seen before. And Harris deserves a lot of credit for turning that team around.
There was a unique dynamic at that time, too, between Bucky Harris and Ty Cobb, and lots of drama around Ty Cobb. But here again, something else going on that was certainly new. What was it about the two of them that ended up being such led to such a competitive spirit during that time?
It was almost a generational divide. They were only 10 years apart, but 10 years is essentially a generation in baseball. So, Cobb was more of the old school mentality, although Bucky Harris certainly had that in him as well. So Cobb was player manager of the Tigers, so he had the same job responsibilities as Harris. But he thought he could really play mind games on those young kids, so he taunted him at times. He called him babyface and snookums. I had to look that one up. It's an old school term for like child, an endearing term for the child. And Harris eventually won him over, but not with anything in terms of being nice. He won over by playing tough. So here's a good example. And I heard this from Bucky Harris's son, actually, about 10 years ago, who ended up becoming a federal judge. Quick footnote. So there was a game where Cobb had spiked the Senators' young third baseman, and Harris was furious about that. So after that, the Harris and Cobb had this dynamic on double plays. Harris was second baseman. Every time Cobb would come in to try to break up a double play, Harris would throw the ball right at Cobb's head. And Cobb, in turn, when he got around that throw, he would spike Harris. And really, that's how the game was played back then. It wasn't that unusual, but this was kind of taking it to another level. And you'd think that might have angered Cobb, but I think quite to the contrary. He later paid him the ultimate compliment. The quote he said was, quote, "He was my kind of ball player, and we always played hard against each other. Hard, but always with respect."
Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a nonprofit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody. Our guest today is Fred Frommer. Fred Frommer is a Smithsonian Associate, will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes for more information about Fred Frommer and his wonderful new book, You Gotta Have Heart, Washington Baseball from Walter Johnson to the 2019 World Series champion Nationals. The then Senators had Walter Johnson playing, and you mentioned a little bit about Walter Johnson. He was a little older, as you say, but he really had this heroic season, and it was very, very genuine. And given his career up to that point, he really did some amazing things and was just a significant contributor to the season, to the team's victory, to their legacy. Tell us a little bit about Walter Johnson and what that moment was about.
Yeah, you could make the argument he's the best pitcher in baseball history. He has the most shutouts of any pitcher. At one point, he had the record for most strikeouts. That's been broken, but he's also second in wins to Cy Young. And, fans literally were rooting for him. He'd go into another ballpark, at least in that 1924 season, and they would root for him to defeat their own team. I was so excited as they were for the Senators and really specifically for Johnson. As great as that season was, the World Series was really a tough start for him. He lost the first game in a pitcher's duel, and then he comes back in Game 5 and gives up 13 hits, very uncharacteristically for him. So he loses that game. He's 0-2. And after Game 5, he said he probably would retire. And with no more starts scheduled, it looked like he was going to go out as a two-time loser in his only World Series appearance. The New York Times really captured the angst of this. They called it, quote, a tragic affair, and Johnson, the most tragic figure that ever stalked through a World Series.
Wow.
But as fate would have it, the Senators brought Johnson in from the bullpen in the ninth inning of Game 7. Now, this is on one day's rest because there were no off days in the World Series. So he pitches Game 5. I think he pitched well over 100 pitches back then. Then it comes back in Game 7. It's ninth inning. He comes in a tie game, pitches 4 scoreless innings. And the Senators finally rallied to win the game in the 12th inning, and Johnson gets his World Series title and a World Series victory. So super happy ending for him, but it was touch and go there for a while as to whether he'd be a World Series hero or a World Series GOAT.
The other interesting quote that I found that you uncovered was this amazing quote from the Giants manager at the time, John McGraw, who not only conceded to Washington after winning the series, but said that the greatest thing that could have happened to baseball was Washington's winning the series, and they did it in a remarkable way. Tell us a little bit about that Game 7 victory, and a little bit about what John McGraw's remark related to, and how powerful and potent it was at that time.
Well, the Senators tied that game up in the 8th inning on a ground ball that took a bad hop or hit a pebble. Nobody really knows for sure, but it definitely had a misdirection as it was going over the third baseman's head. And almost the identical thing happened on the game-winning hit. So it really was quite a dramatic victory. And I think that, what the Giants manager, McGraw, was referring to there is, the Senators were, as I mentioned earlier, such an underdog. They were a David to a pair of monstrous Goliaths. First the Yankees and the Giants. Those teams are almost like that team in that Bugs Bunny cartoon, or those cigar-smoking bullies or swinging bats with telephone poles. That's kind of who they were. The Senators were kind of like Bugs Bunny. They had 22 home runs. They weren't a physically strong team, but they could beat you. And by the way, that cartoon was set at the Polo Grounds, so there's another connection there. In terms of the inspiration, like an inspirational moment of that season, and I definitely would put Johnson's World Series victory in Game 7 at the top. But there was something else I wanted to highlight, which is in June of that year, and as I mentioned earlier, the Senators started off pretty much a 500 team for the first couple of months. They put together a little bit of a modest winning streak, and they go to the Bronx for a 4-game series against the Yankees, who were in first place at the time. Well, the Senators shock the baseball world by sweeping the 4 games in New York, and they come back to Washington in first place. And there are 8,000 fans waiting for them at Union Station. They're just so excited for this team that's finally putting together a pennant run, which is the first one they'd had ever, at least in the modern era. And the Senators, was a long struggle back and forth with the Yankees, but the Senators played great baseball the rest of the season and finally clinched the pennant on the second to last game of the year.
Society was different then, of course, but it still meant so much to have this team, in the public eye. That's different than today. Maybe the athletes were different. It was small ball there. We're all so familiar with the long ball today and just the big home run hitters. What other kind of contrasting elements do you see between then and now? Well,
there was just a lot less entertainment options at the time. So, baseball really captured the imagination of the public for that summer and into the fall, to the point where, there's no TV. Radio was pretty early on. So a lot of the ways that the Senators fans were able to watch or kind of monitor the games at Polo Grounds when the Senators were on the road in the World Series was they would watch mechanical scoreboards recreate the action on the sides of office buildings. Or this is even a more interesting way to do it, in my opinion. There was a Marine band that would go down in Washington's ballpark, Griffith Stadium, and they'd pantomime the action based on wired teletypes that were coming from New York City.
Wow.
So there really wasn't you didn't have people distracted by putting on a Netflix movie or even putting on a sitcom for that matter. There was really much less entertainment back then. So I think that's one reason that they were able to capture the imagination of many Americans in a way that it's much harder to do in today's fragmented society.
What do you hope that we remember? It's the centennial time of the Senators' World Series win, and there was just some timeless lessons that came out of this team, and the kind of the genuine remark by John McGraw, the just capturing the spirit of the nation at that time. What is it that you think is just so important to remember about this team?
Well, as corny as it sounds, I think they really were a team of destiny, and I mentioned those bad hop grounders that tied the game and won the game in the World Series. That's one example. And if you look at the 2019 World Series champion Nationals, it seems to me that they were almost channeling that team. They have so much in common. They both got off to really slow starts. They upset heavily favored teams in the World Series, and they even staged multi-run seventh-game comebacks. Now, I am not a superstitious person, except when it comes to baseball. Then I am. And I want to share this quote from Fred Lieb, who some of your listeners might know was a very famous sports writer back in the 1920s. And he's talking about that World Series game-winning hit, the one that hit the pebble or whatever, somehow had a bad hop that won the game. And he says, quote, "Perhaps the millions of fans pulling for Washington to win its first World Series championship influenced the usually fickle goddess of luck to give a little lift to the gallant Nationals." Nationals was the AKA name of the Senators. And it's hard to argue with that. I mean, you do see teams that, you saw with the Senators in 1924. I think you definitely saw it with the Red Sox in 2004. Once they came back against the Yankees, you could see the Cardinals had no chance in the World Series. These teams get a certain momentum, and maybe it is just momentum. Maybe it's a baseball goddess or baseball god, but somehow they capture this energy, and there's just no stopping them. And I think that definitely characterized the 1924 Senators.
Thank you, Fred Fromer. Again, our guest is Smithsonian Associate Fred Fromer, who's written this wonderful book, You Gotta Have Heart, Washington Baseball from Walter Johnson to the 2019 World Series champion Nationals. Fred Fromer will be at Smithsonian Associate. There'll be lots of links so that you can find direct connection to Smithsonian Associate. It's in our show notes today, as well as Fred Fromer's work. But thanks. This is just a scrappy team, a scrappy bunch, and I know your presentation is going to just be wonderful, taking advantage of all of that. We look forward to it, Fred.
Thank you, Paul. I enjoyed talking with you.
My thanks to Smithsonian Associate Fred Fromer. Smithsonian Associate Fred Fromer will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up, and the title of his presentation is Washington's First World Series When the Washington Senators Were America's Team. For more information about Fred Fromer's Smithsonian Associates presentation, please check out our show notes today. My thanks to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support the show. My thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Please be well, be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast.